Good morning, and welcome to the first Voices of Alzheimer's webinar. I'm Jim Taylor. I'm the president and CEO of Voices of Alzheimer's, VOA, and this is my wife, Jerry, who has been living with Alzheimer's for more than 10 years. VOA was launched as an organization last fall with the goal of empowering people living with or at risk of Alzheimer's and other cognitive illnesses to drive equitable access to innovation in treatment and care. We aim to create a society that respects the voices and choices of people living with AD, Alzheimer's disease, and other cognitive illnesses in managing their own health and well-being. During our discussion this morning, you can submit questions by opening the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And if you're having any trouble, technical, or can't enter your question, then just click on our hosts, Katie or Kim, and send them your message. We'll be recording this session and posting it on our website. Our website is voicesofad, one word, .com, voicesofad.com, if you'd like to share it with your friends or listen to parts of it again. If you're already a member, we're very happy to have you join us. And if you're not yet a member, we'd love for you to go to our website, voicesofad.com, and register to become a member of our organization. Now let's go to our program. Today, we are talking about the exciting new treatments available for Alzheimer's disease, including those that are still in the pipeline, and the barriers that individuals approved by the FDA to receive these treatments are facing in accessing them. First, I'll let our speakers say a little bit more about themselves. We are really delighted. When we began our organization, we promised that we would provide stalwarts, outstanding individuals in our Alzheimer's community to speak with you at our webinars. And we have, I think, surpassed that this morning with our first choice of speakers, joined by Dr. Sharon Cohen, who's the founder and medical director of the Toronto Memory Program, and Rob Egge, who's the chief policy officer for the Alzheimer's Association and executive director of AIM, the Alzheimer's Impact Movement. Sharon, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jim and Jerry. I'm really honored to be part of this session today. I'm a neurologist. My specialty is Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. I've worked for 30 years in the trenches with my patients, with their families, to try and clarify diagnoses with whatever tools we've had throughout the 30 years, and they've improved. To get to an early and accurate diagnosis and then to move treatment forward. We really have had a paucity of treatments, and we'll talk more about that, but it's absolutely imperative in my mind that we do better with this disease so people can live more successfully with it. So my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Sharon. How about you, Rob?
So first of all, Jim, Jerry, thank you so much for hosting us today. Really appreciate the conversation with Dr. Cohen as well. And appreciate the work you're doing, dedicating your lives to making a difference for everyone. And thanks to everyone who's joined as well with that same spirit. So trying to keep it somewhat concise, but also true to the topic today, I'll tell them a little bit about my background that way. I first came into contact, regrettably, with dementia in a way that I remember with my grandmother. And what struck me quite a few years ago now, in that context, was I can't believe we don't have a treatment for this. There's nothing that my grandmother can take. It was contrary to my experience with every other condition at that point, that there was nothing. It was hard for me to believe. Quite a few years later, I was working in health policy, and this just gives you another sort of window on this, and was focused on a group here in Washington supporting that was focused on long-term care. And in that context too, dementia was the theme that just kept coming up. And in that context, one of the underlying points was, again, no treatment, right? This is just something we had to figure out how to deal with because it shaped everything in that context. But then I had the opportunity, accelerating a bit in this story, to work with the Alzheimer's Association in 2009 and joined and been focused ever since. I'll just tell one more little anecdote in that regard, again, about this theme and why it's so exciting now to be in an era of treatment, even as we deal with some obstacles in the way right now. And that's that there was a bill that was passed called the National Alzheimer's Project Act around 2010 And what that bill required was create a national strategy. And in that context, a lot of us were thinking about what should be in that strategy. And one thing the association did is hold town hall meetings across the country on this topic. It won't surprise anybody that the number one thing that people said who are facing this disease is we need treatments. That's what we have to be focused on. Credit to the federal government. The top priority in that plan has been ever since to have effective treatments. And now we find ourselves there. We just have some important things to address along the way, Jim, that I know you're going to focus on. So thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sharon. I got to tell our viewers that our two guests this morning are very warm individuals, and they're both very modest. So take what they've told you, multiply it times 10, and you can begin to understand the impact that they have through their dedication to finding a cure for us and improving our treatment. That's the impact they've had on this community. So we're very grateful to have you both. But let me go back to my script now. And Sharon, we can start the questions with you. If you would, tell us about what the current treatments options are for Alzheimer's disease. How effective are they? And are there potential side effects?
So current treatments we can think of as the established treatments that we've had for about 20 years now, and I'll talk about those. But then there are newer treatments that haven't yet become standard of care, but they are exciting. So we definitely want to talk about those. As far as the established treatments, you know, this goes back to the 1990s with the first drug. Some of you will recognize the brand name Aricept or donepezil being approved. And since that time, you know, 3 in that same class, and then another one in another class, memantine, and they became the standard of care. And what do these drugs do? They boost or modulate chemicals at a relatively late stage of disease when people already have dementia. And so this is not tackling the early changes in Alzheimer's disease in the brain. It's tackling fairly substantial symptomatic disease. And the impact of these medicines has been modest. And I don't say that in a negative way, because anything that helps this very serious disease is important. So we were excited in the 1990s to finally have a first treatment. However, over the 20 years, what we've learned is these treatments are just not enough. They're relatively safe. The side effect profiles are fairly benign, some nausea, diarrhea in some. Most people can tolerate the medicines though. However, this symptom improvement, as I said, is modest. It doesn't endure in the sense that the underlying disease progresses. So even if the symptoms are boosted a little bit, people are still declining after 3 to 6 months or so. So it's imperative to have more effective, longer acting symptom treatments, but also to modify the disease and slow the disease. And that brings me to the second class of treatment that is new and important, and in my view is not yet being valued highly enough. So we have 2 medicines now approved by the FDA through the accelerated pathway of approval. And the point of the accelerated pathway is to try and get early access to patients so people don't have to wait if they have a serious condition like Alzheimer's and there's a promising treatment, that they would have access. So aducanumab was the first, June 2021, and very recently lecanemab in January 2023 was approved through this accelerated pathway. And these are very different from the established standard of care. These medicines remove amyloid from the brain. So they get at the very earliest changes that we can detect in people developing Alzheimer's. And the medicines are indicated for people at early symptomatic stages, even pre-dementia, the stage we call mild cognitive impairment and the mild dementia phase. So it's very important that we catch a progressive disease early and that we have hope that we can slow the disease as these medicines do.
And the FDA is the U.S. federal.
Yes, so
Federal
the
Drug
Food and Drug Administration that looks at the dossiers provided for clinical trials by manufacturers and makes a decision as to whether a drug is safe and whether it is effective. So it will approve a drug that is safe and effective, and it may require some conditions be met, additional data be submitted through the FDA channels.
So we promised each other this morning, viewers, that we would try to help each other not speak in acronyms in terms that we might not be communicating well with you. So Rob, pivoting a little bit, how do patients, people living with the disease, pay for these treatments?
Right. Well, in general, in the United States, if you're over age 65, typically you're a Medicare beneficiary. And then you have different opportunities in terms of, without getting the details, different types of Medicare. One called Medicare Advantage, another sometimes called traditional Medicare. And in those cases, you may well have a copay, part that you have to pay out of pocket. But Medicare, without getting the details, covers the bulk of it. For those who are under 65, which many people, of course, that be eligible for these treatments are, that's a very significant population, those under 65 with Alzheimer's that could benefit from these treatments, depending on their circumstances. That's usually in the United States through private insurers. And often that comes through the workplace. So just a side note here, that one of the real dilemmas of this terrible disease is that it can make you have to give up your employment in the United States if you're under 65. And then at the same time, you're trying to figure out how to pay for the treatments you need when you're not yet eligible for Medicare. So that's a very important aside. I won't go further into it except for to note its importance. Well, the upshot here, though, is also with these treatments that Dr. Cohen described, the price that for these treatments is about on par with many biologics for different diseases, but it's expensive. So if you look at what the manufacturer has estimated for lecanemab, or now called Leqembi, is how you may hear it referred to, that has been estimated by the manufacturer Eisai to be $26,500 per year. So if you have to pay that out of pocket, needless to say, there are very, very few people who can afford to do so.
And are there different ways that diagnosed individuals are able to access treatment, Rob?
Yeah, so in general, Jim, I think sort of behind that question is like, what are the pathways? And Dr. Cohen may want to comment on this as well. But generally speaking, what you'll have to do is you'll have to go through a series of steps in order to determine if this is appropriate for you. And first of all, there's sometimes what we refer to as detection is language we might use. And that's a basic understanding, like something's not right. I need to figure out what it is. And we urge people to go ahead when you have concerns about your memory or behavior to go ahead and talk with your healthcare provider to do that. That's step one, right? And then there can be, depending on that conversation, how it unfolds, it could have become apparent that we really need to get a handle on this more specifically, and that can lead to diagnostic work. And that may be, for instance, in time lead to a PET scan. There we have an issue too in terms of coverage in the United States about PET scans. That in turn could lead to understanding if you're in the right place for one of these treatments. And again, details I'll defer to Dr. Cohen on, but there too, you could say I'm at an appropriate stage. I've confirmed to have beta amyloid in my brain through a PET scan or through spinal fluid. And therefore, they would have a discussion about whether this is something to pursue. Jim, did I get your question there?
Great. And Dr. Cohen, many people who can't afford these medications might alternatively think about participation in clinical trials. I know you're very active in that aspect of research. Could you tell us a little bit about that opportunity for individuals?
Yes, for sure. I'm very much in favor of clinical trials. They are the hope for the future and provide us evidence that leads to either abandoning an approach if it doesn't work or embracing and moving forward an approach if it is successful. With drugs that are already approved, if we talk about aducanumab, which was the first disease-slowing drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration, a confirmatory trial was required as a condition of approval by the Food and Drug Administration. So there is a study called the Envision study, which is a phase 3B or phase 4 confirmatory study, which would allow individuals who may be eligible, so people with mild cognitive impairment, mild dementia thought to be due to Alzheimer's disease, and within the study, a PET scan would be provided, covered by the research grant, not out of pocket by the patient, and access to the medicine or placebo. So there's the catch with participating in a trial. However, this confirmatory trial, when it eventually reads out, hopefully will lead to more formal, full, non-conditional approval of aducanumab. With lecanemab, there is a trial going on that is a prevention trial for people who still have normal cognitive testing. They may have some cognitive symptoms, and on further evaluation in screening for the trial, they have amyloid in the brain. So they have the earliest change of Alzheimer's disease in the brain, but they're still cognitively normal as far as our testing goes. And that's the AHEAD study, which is running at many centers throughout the States. However, as far as people who have the indication for Leqembi or lecanemab now, that's the mild cognitive impairment and mild dementia group, there is not another trial run by the manufacturer to enroll in. So it begs the question, how do people get access if the cost is prohibitive? Right. And I'm sure Rob will say more about the approach that the Medicare and Medicaid are taking to that, and whether we think that's satisfactory or not.
I would just add that Jerry participated in the aducanumab clinical trial for 7 years, and we feel that though not everyone did, that she benefited greatly by participation, and it enriched our lives very much. So, Rob.
Yeah, and I want to say, Jim, thank you, Jerry and Jim, for participating, because you brought forward a medicine that we wouldn't otherwise have. And many of my patients and families would say the same. That medicine, aducanumab, we participated in those trials, and also lecanemab trials. That medicine slowed the disease. It kept me functioning better and kept the disease mild longer. So yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I also think, Sharon, excuse me, that people underestimate the psychological advantage of being in a trial. We would drive home, we would have to drive 2 hours each way to be in the trial. And driving home, I would often laugh that Jerry was just so ecstatic. You know, I felt like she was Madame Curie in the car with me, and that she was waiting in line to get her Nobel Prize along with the other researchers around the microscope looking at the results of the study. But it really, there are not a lot of things you can do to manage this disease, and really participating in a clinical trial is one of, we believe, one of the most important. But Rob, let me go back now. Dr. Cohen has explained that there are some exciting new disease-modifying therapies available, approved by the FDA, and yet they're not completely available or generally available to people who the FDA authorized those drugs for. Can you tell us why those drugs might be restricted?
You know, in a sense, Jim, I can't, because on the merits, it shouldn't be. So speaking personally from that direction, no, I can't come up with a satisfying explanation for why they would not be accessible to everyone today under Medicare. But I take the spirit of your question, and I'll say a bit more about that, of course. So in general, I think I and many others see this as both one of the most exciting times we've ever had in the field and one of the most troubling times. Dr. Cohen really laid out wonderfully that why this is such an exciting time. And it's also tempered by the fact that we know this is not where we want to end up, but what an important step it is. We need to be working with treatments for all dementia, and we need to have satisfying solutions for those who progress past the point where people will be eligible for this treatment. So that's all true. We also know, in terms of confidence and sort of where we're looking ahead, that we look at other chronic diseases, that HIV/AIDS, many cancers, just you name them, it hasn't been like a polio vaccine that at once solves the problem. But if you look back after 2 decades of progress, you're in a totally different world. And that's what we hope and expect with good confidence we could see in this space as well. So how wonderful would that be? At the same time, then, with all that reason for optimism, tempered optimism, but true optimism, we find ourselves with a frustrating or infuriating, you pick your word depending on the time of day for me, between what the federal government has done in the United States about coverage. So we applaud the FDA for the decisions it made. This isn't just, when I say the federal government, it's maybe an agency by agency story. And I remember, Jim, about acronyms. There's another one called CMS in the United States. That's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that oversees Medicare. And that agency has decided in an unprecedented way, no exaggeration here, that for the first time ever, they would not provide Medicare coverage for these 2 FDA-approved treatments. For every other FDA-approved treatment, period, in Medicare, they cover it. But here they don't. So they've made this decision. Again, I'll try and stay a level above details that might not be that important to know, but perhaps, and we'll see in the Q&A, happy to answer more about this. But generally, they've had a coverage policy that they've laid out. That even went further than what I've described. They didn't just say for these 2 treatments. They said preemptively that any future treatment, there's some reasons to be optimistic about future treatments in the same class that are coming forward. They are not going to cover those as well unless and until they decide otherwise. And if I could just keep piling on, and you'll see where the frustration or feeling a bit infuriated at times comes from, they have specified 3 questions for what would allow them to feel comfortable providing coverage in something they call coverage under evidence development. Those 3 questions are so vague and open-ended that they provide really no guidance into what they're thinking and what would possibly meet that criteria to get out of this penalty box and be covered just like every other treatment is under Medicare that's approved by the FDA, every other drug, I should say. And an example of those questions are, I don't know if I'll get this exactly right, but one of them is, how do the benefits and harms change over time? So you just think about that question. Wouldn't that apply to every single treatment that ever has been approved by the FDA? Of course it would. Right, so they've laid out questions that can't be precisely answered. We don't know when we satisfied them in terms of the answer. There's been very little feedback on the merits of, in terms of evidence, what specifically is needed. It's just more of a, well, not good enough. We'll tell you when it is. That is the world that we live in. At the same time, we estimate more than 2,000 individuals per day are progressing past the point when they would be eligible for these treatments. So this is not just an abstract, we're impatient because we're excited and want to get there. These are people's lives right now. They're losing out on the ability to access these treatments that have been proven in a rigorous study to provide benefit. It's really an outrageous place to be. And Jim, you're on mute at this moment.
Thank you. Say something more about those 2,000 people a day. Why are they eligible yesterday and not eligible today?
Well, you know, if maybe Dr. Cohen from a medical perspective would want to, that one, I'd be happy to jump in.
Yeah, for sure. And Rob, thank you for explaining, and I share your frustration and infuriation. Maybe I lean more towards the infuriation because this is just not right. What happens in Alzheimer's disease is there is a slow but relentless progression of disease, both biologically in the brain, but clinically. And by that, I mean that people start out with very subtle symptoms. They progress slowly to more substantial symptoms that then start interfering with daily activities. So maybe I can't drive anymore, but I can still shop. And then gradually I can't shop, I can't work. You start shaving away the things that you're able to do independently. And when you get to a certain stage, that's no longer the stage where a medicine like Leqembi or aducanumab has been assessed to be safe and effective. So it's imperative that we catch the disease early so that people who, for example, have mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia due to Alzheimer's have not progressed to more moderate, stage, excuse me, stage of disease and miss the opportunity are no longer eligible. So when you think about any other disease, we try and catch it early, whether it's a cancer or some other insidious disease that progresses. We don't wait until it's later established. And yet, if we require additional evidence as set out through Medicare and Medicaid that isn't really readily available for people to contribute to, there isn't a structure established to even answer the questions that Rob laid out that are being asked, then we're just losing time. And time is not something that we have to waste in this disease.
Thank you. That's really highlights the urgency, and Rob's example of the 2,000 people every day, the urgency of why we are marshaling our forces to strongly object as strongly as we possibly can to this CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, restriction on access. So let's pivot back to clinical trials a minute, Sharon. Dr. Cohen, what does it look like to receive access to treatment in a clinical trial? And let's start there.
So in the clinical trials that I participate in, which are pharmacologic trials looking at an intervention with a medication, and the protocol is drawn up through a number of experts working with the manufacturer, and then approved by regulators like the FDA and approved by research ethics boards to make sure that the rights of patients are being addressed and that the protocol is adequately designed to enroll human subjects. Then there may be multiple sites around the world, or it depends study to study what this looks like, and a drug will go through various stages of development from phase 1, phase 2, and then very important large phase 3 studies, which are the pivotal trials that can lead to full approval of a drug. And some of us have followed what happened with the the fast tracking of COVID-19 vaccine. So we're a little bit familiar with going from phase 1, 2, and 3. And when there's a great interest and investment in an area, as there was with COVID, we can get there faster. And that happened in breast cancer. That happened with HIV, when people really rallied around the importance of moving research forward. And we need this in Alzheimer's disease. But joining a trial, each trial will have a protocol and will have eligibility criteria. So this drug being tested may be for people at a very early stage, a middle stage, a later stage of disease, may require people to have certain characteristics or other features in terms of their general health or their disease state to be eligible. But through a trial, as perhaps you and Jerry experienced, you become part of pioneering with a team. You have regular visits, not just to receive a treatment, either by intravenous infusion or a pill, depending on the study and the study medicine, but detailed discussions with a study doctor, a study nurse, coordinator, people who are really expert and interested in how you're doing. And these studies tend to be, anywhere from a year to, depending on, the nature of the study, a prevention study at phase 3 might be 4.5 years. So there's a real connection between the research team and the study participants. And most participants really feel the experience is valuable. And in fact, there's a letdown when the trial ends. What do we do next?
Right. Thank you. So, Rob, what's your perspective on what the CMS, the Medicare restrictions on Alzheimer's treatments has on clinical research and drug development overall?
Well, it's not good. I'll start there with a very safe statement, understatement. This has been an area, I'll just say from our perspective as an organization, and probably Voice, I won't speak for you, Jim, but you probably share this approach. We're not here for pharma companies. That's not our mission. Our mission is for patients, constituents, right? And so this answers from that perspective, which is to say then that we have a grave concern because to get to the treatments that we need, we rely on industry, biopharma, based on good basic science, and that's been well funded by the federal governments and philanthropists, that progresses then through all the way till we have treatments. It's a pipeline where every partner is critical. And it has to be mentioned that pharmaceutical companies for years have invested heavily in treatments with no return. They've taken that risk and have had nothing to show for it. And so if you were to make it even less certain about how a treatment that gets to the goal line, even gets through FDA's approval, is that going to be covered and available to people? Of course, that's going to have a chilling impact. If it didn't have a chilling impact, I think shareholders in that company would be pretty concerned that people in the company aren't assessing the risks commercially well enough. And so it's a straightforward proposition that when there's uncertainty and closed doors, that these private partners may decide we're going to focus elsewhere where the regulatory environment's clear and where we know our efforts will be rewarded. So again, just back where I started, I'm not saying that out of compassion or sympathy for pharmaceutical companies. I'm saying that because it's a real risk then to us, our community that needs these kinds of treatments available.
So we've spoken about our outrage, and then there's a real, for people like Jerry and myself living in the community, on the one hand, we get the great rising our hopes with the approval of really, life-altering disease-modifying treatments, and then have a decision from our insurers, because Medicare, we are both covered by Medicare, who says, no, sorry, we need more information. And that's very confusing, and it's extremely disheartening. So what are the steps, Rob, that are underway to modify? Or is it possible that CMS could change, or what are we doing? What's being done?
Yeah, again, everything is a little bit of oversimplification perhaps, but there's essentially two paths to do this. One is through defined regulatory steps that could be taken, directly engaging with CMS to appeal to them and provide our feedback into that process along with many others, and help them reach the right decision. And so let me start there. One of those steps, once this this decision that I described earlier was finalized this past April, almost a year ago, you were left with the formal process would be to file a request for reconsideration, is the jargon for it. And we and others have done this as well, like the American Academy of Neurology. But in our case, the Alzheimer's Association, we submitted such a request. I'm proud of that request. It was a very thoughtful document, I believe, that reflected, I think, what you and others would see as well as the essential points we're all focused on here, why that was a poor decision and needs to be changed. And one trigger for it that gave us standing to make this request that CMS lays out is, has there been new evidence since the time that we made our decision that's a basis for reconsideration? And we had that this last fall, and Dr. Cohen knows this well as somebody who's intimately involved in it, when something called the Clarity AD study for lecanemab, those phase 3 results were released. They were published because CMS, understandably, cares a lot about peer-reviewed publication. These results were published in a top-notch journal, New England Journal of Medicine, and were presented publicly. That unequivocally showed in a very rigorous, well-conducted trial that benefits were achieved. Gave us just the evidence that you could argue about in the past, where evidence stood in April. We don't need to do that because this was absolutely crystal clear. Should answer every one of the questions that CMS has. Certainly is the match of any other, well, I want to be too sweeping things, certainly is a match of lots of other Medicare drugs, approved drugs, covered drugs today. No doubt it clears those bars, no doubt. Yet, when that was the basis for our request for consideration, again, we just recently received a reply from Medicare, CMS, that said, nope, thank you, but we're not finding this new evidence satisfactorily, but there was no discussion of why not. It was simply just not good enough. We still have these questions. And that is just maddening, isn't it? When that happens. So that's what we faced on that regulatory front. That's option one. Option two is that, as somebody referred to it recently in an organization, harkening back to a civil rights phrase, there could be good trouble, right? We rally attention to this, and we get others who can intervene and speak out to help us make the case that CMS has got to take our community seriously and not allow this to go on, blocking coverage when the evidence is so clear based on the science. And to that extent, one of the best ways we can do that, many routes, but one of them is through Congress. And so in our case, and others have done this too, we've met with the White House, we've met with the Department of Health, HHS, Health and Human Services, which oversees CMS. So in between the White House and CMS is HHS, as we refer to it. We've met with all these groups to make the case there, so everybody knows what's going on. And then with Congress, we've had advocates across the country in January that went to approach every member of Congress to say, could you join us in speaking out about this? We were gratified with the results. We saw that both in the House and the Senate, there were bipartisan letters with sign-ons from Republicans and Democrats who said to CMS, this has got to change. It didn't sway them because they gave us the response after those letters were delivered to them. But by no means do we think this is the end of the road. We're going to have advocates come from across the country in March here to Washington, meet with every member of Congress, and this will be the #1 discussion topic we have, is
Wonderful.
to change this.
Wonderful. Sharon, I know being a Canadian, you're not probably allowed to join or are you, the American Academy of Neurologists? But you know, it's one thing, I think, to say no with an unexplained response to the Alzheimer's Association, which, you know, is, you know, by far the most significant Alzheimer's service organization we in our nation, at least. But the American Academy of Neurologists, which I think has 12,000 professional physicians, has also filed a request asking for reconsideration. How? I mean, these are the experts. And essentially, by asking for that request, I think it essentially says, as Rob has so well described, you know, there's additional information. You should be reconsidering this because we think that your current stance is not correct. In my own interpretation. Do you think that could make a difference? Or as a neurologist yourself, what's the impact there? It certainly makes us even angrier.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point.
Yeah.
So, Jim, Canadians can be members, Canadian neurologists can be members of the American Academy. That's #1, and they should be, because it's an important organization.
Of course.
I think it's admirable that the American Academy of Neurology has taken a position that CMS needs to reconsider their decision. Their decision was wrong. It was biased. It doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, there's some self-inflicted wounds with the American Academy of Neurology because they themselves did not come out very strongly in favor of aducanumab, and their messaging is not really strong about anti-amyloid therapies. So, you know, what can we do as neurologists? We need to get our act together. We need to listen to our patients better, and we need to know the data well. It's important to realize that the percentage of neurologists who are dementia specialists or Alzheimer's specialists is a very small proportion of neurologists in general. And there are more neurologists in the United States than Canada, but nonetheless, the dementia experts are the minority. And so it's up to us to educate our colleagues in neurology about how important this is so more of us can make noise. And I think it's also important for patients to shake things up and say to their neurologist, hey, you know, can you do something? Will you speak out for us? Because Alzheimer's disease is a disease that can be ignored, and we just can't do that. None of us can ignore this disease. So I'm very in favor of lending more voices, whether it's the neurologist voice or the patient and family speaking through their neurologist. very important.
Great. Thank you for that message to us as well. I'd like to, I have lots more questions, but I see Katie has come on and she has questions from our audience. Katie, want to tell us what the audience is saying beside applause?
Sure. So we've gotten some really fantastic questions from the audience. And I will say, if anyone asks a question and we're not able to get to it today, we can follow up with you after the fact, or I did drop a resource from the Alzheimer's Association in the chat and welcome everyone to make use of that. There's three main areas that I want to cover, so combining a few questions here. And the first is for Sharon. So I want to talk a little bit about clinical trials. The first is a question about how would you get started accessing a clinical trial, but related to that, if you have already been in a clinical trial, are you able to access another one that may give you access to a new treatment? And related to that, if you have tau tangles but not amyloid, could you get access to Leqembi or aducanumab, or is that only amyloid?
Okay, so a whole lot of questions.
A whole lot of questions.
One question, but that's okay. So how does one get access to clinical trials? So some physicians will be much more knowledgeable than others about where the local, clinical research site is, and will be able to refer you on to somebody. But I would think the Alzheimer's Association could also link people who are interested to trials. And then there's a website that's not particularly user-friendly, but it's called clinicaltrials.gov, and it does list all of the trials. You would put in Alzheimer's disease as your area of interest, and it would list studies going on and often the investigators and the research centers participating. So there are a number of ways that one can find out about clinical trials. If there's a particular clinical trial, for example, I mentioned the AHEAD prevention trial with Leqembi, one can also go to the manufacturer website to find out information. So again, a number of ways to find out about trials, and people should be motivated to find out. This is a serious disease. We don't yet have a cure. Let's make sure that people are connected with research centers. If you've participated in a trial and that trial ended, yes, often you will be eligible to participate in another trial. And we have many people at our research site who have been in a number of trials and have pioneered with us through a number of different therapies. So again, it will depend a little bit on the eligibility criteria for each study and how much the disease has progressed and whether there's a good fit. But that will take the research site giving you the information on whether they have a trial that's a good fit for you. And sorry, there was a third part to your question, and I think I've forgotten. Maybe this was a memory test.
The last was if you have tau tangles but aren't
tau tangles,
positive. Yeah.
Thank you,
you
Katie.
eligible?
Thank you. Yes. So some studies screen participants for eligibility by looking at a biomarker in the blood, a blood test for tau, or a tau PET scan. And if those tests are negative, it doesn't mean there's no amyloid, but it may mean, and this is the case in our center, that you need a study that actually tests for amyloid, and that would be through an amyloid PET scan or a spinal tap to show there's amyloid, because amyloid is an earlier change than tau. However, if someone has had an amyloid test and they don't have amyloid, but they are positive for tau, then the diagnosis is not Alzheimer's. And it depends what the diagnosis is thought to be as to whether there would be a research study that would be appropriate, but it wouldn't be an Alzheimer's study. So I hope that's not too confusing. It's a great question.
It is. Thank you so much. Another set of questions for Rob, talking a little bit about CMS. And the first is you used words like unprecedented, and that this is the first time ever. And I think the question is how can that be true? How is that possibly true? But the follow-up question is, who is making these decisions at CMS? How are they chosen or being put into the position to make the decisions that are coming out of that agency and obviously affecting so many people.
Yeah. So on the use of words like unprecedented, there's kind of two ways to answer that. How could it be true and how do we know it's true? So let me take the second one, which is how do we know it's true? Which when Medicare, CMS makes these determinations, they have to use a formal process. And it leaves an evidence trail. And what that is are these national coverage determinations. There aren't that many of them. So typically what happens, let me talk about normally. Normally, CMS is quiet after an FDA approval. There's a presumption of coverage. It's not always necessarily smooth for any given individual, but there's a presumption of coverage, and that's how things proceed forward. They never release a determination. So when they're going to have a national determination that say is a blanket policy for Medicare across the country, where they're going to cover it or we're not, and there could be some stipulations, they have to lay that out in a way that everyone can look through. So there aren't that many of them. And we've gone through every single one and confirmed the fact that this is the first time for a drug that has never not been covered by Medicare. So we can say that with confidence. So this is a factually true statement. It's unprecedented. So we've already kind of answered the question, and I told you it's a head scratcher about like, how are they doing this in terms of rationale? But yeah, that's the answer on that front. And then Sharon had trouble with the three-part question. I had trouble with the two-part question. There's a second part to this one.
It's a test here we've got for you. No, the second part is who are the people making these decisions within CMS?
Right.
How do they get there?
So, yeah, I want to just start sincerely. I strongly disagree with this group, but they're fine individuals, and within Medicare that I'm describing right now, who I have no doubt are doing what they think is best. But you can't ask how much I disagree with them on that point. And these are individuals within something called the Coverage and Analysis Group within Medicare. And it's a relatively small team. I'm actually pulled Jim into this conversation because he and his colleagues had an interesting way of sort of framing what's the challenge there for this group. I'll say it this way, is they do not have resources anywhere close to the Food and Drug Administration for evaluating the scientific merits and evidence about whether a drug is safe and effective, whether to use CMS language they will refer to as a statute is it reasonable and necessary. But they just don't have the bandwidth with, they're smart people, but not in this area. They don't have that background. And so on its face, it's troubling to have them effectively second guess the FDA on this. It's a group of about, let's just say approximately 10 people. And they don't have that scientific background in Alzheimer's specifically for sure, in order to evaluate evidence and reach these conclusions. So it's a really smart question with a point behind it, I think, by whoever asked it, that this is a group that's not the right one in terms of our federal expertise to be evaluating these questions.
I think I've seen a number of comments, and I think we can agree here that it, it's concerning. That's a major concern.
Yep.
So the last set of questions, I think, I would like to direct to both of you. Maybe Rob, we can start with you, but what's in the near future? So Leqembi is going through a process. What does that look like for the FDA and CMS, and what's on the horizon? And then Sharon, I'll go to you with what's on the research horizon. What are you excited about as our next set of hopefully exciting headlines about treatments for Alzheimer's? So Rob?
Yeah, so I'll start. I'm excited for Dr. Cohen's answer because it's pretty exciting what's coming. And not just, I don't know if you'll get to this, Dr. Cohen, but not just in beta amyloid, but in many different approaches of treatments, strategies for dealing with this and other dementias. So exciting times ahead. On the regulatory front or policy front, I'll broaden that out. It's a real uncertainty. So Medicare, CMS has said that they are putting a lot of stock in what's called traditional approval by the FDA, which is anticipated by most to come in early July for this treatment Leqembi. So they have said some things. Our perspective is, every step of the way, it seemed like the goalposts have shifted. So we put no stock in that, to be blunt about it. And we're continuing to make our arguments to everyone who will listen. And that's the challenge to everybody, I think, on this webinar. Again, thanks for joining, and just find your way to raise your voice, because that's what exactly is what's needed here. When we move ahead there on those fronts, we'll see what that leads to. But I'll just end my comments with a caution, and hopefully we can do this again, Jim, in a year from now and be talking about how things are different, and we don't have to have these notes of caution. But right now we sure do. You know, I think it's been said on this webinar that Alzheimer's and other dementias can be easily overlooked and sort of treated as a second-class disease in terms of the significance and its focus. We saw that years ago, and fortunately the community has rallied and addressed this with Congress in a bipartisan way when medical research funding was so inadequate 10 years ago. That's changed substantially because people have spoken out about that to their elected officials, and it's much different picture. Here again, we're in a place where the precedent could stick if we don't change it. And if you find that hard to believe, the hardest thing to believe at all would be that we're in this place right now, and we're already here, where we have the first two treatments that are not covered by Medicare. So we all have to be very vigilant, very skeptical, and press hard to make sure that we get this right. I'll just close with this. You know, the irony here is that we're not asking for anything special. It's almost the opposite of that. What we want to be treated as a community is the usual. That's what we're looking for. Nothing exceptional. We just want to be treated the same as every other condition. That's why we use language like unprecedented, and that's what we're fighting for.
Wow, I really appreciate how you put things, Rob. I couldn't agree more. There is so much stigma, and it's not just from the community, but it's from CMS, and it's, as I said, self-inflicted to a large part by, you know, physicians who don't really know the data and don't appreciate the urgency of treating and the value of slowing disease at an early stage. So yeah, we need to reverse the decision. I like to be optimistic despite the frustration. The phase 3 Clarity AD study for Leqembi, as Rob said, has been submitted. It was actually submitted by midnight of the same day as the phase 2 data led to the FDA decision to approve Leqembi on the accelerated pathway. The phase 3 data went in. It is a confirmatory trial. It does confirm the safety and efficacy or the effectiveness of the treatment. And so it's in the FDA's hands now to make a decision whether they will grant full unconditional approval rather than this accelerated pathway approval, which is a conditional approval. And if this phase 3 data now leads to FDA full approval, that provides even more leverage for us to make noise with CMS and to say, hey, this is completely ridiculous now. We have the confirmatory trial. We have all this additional data that you say is needed. So you must cover this drug. So that will be later this year, as you heard. And I sure hope there'll be movement there. Rob mentioned some ways that the CMS decision slows down research. It doesn't just slow it down for Leqembi and reduce the the investment and the motivation for pharma companies to be involved in anti-amyloid therapy, because no matter how good the data is, we won't get cost coverage. It also slows down other therapies, because we know with a complicated disease like Alzheimer's, it's not just amyloid and it's not just tau. There's neuroinflammation and other components biologically. And if you don't have a foothold, if you don't let an anti-amyloid treatment become a new standard of care, then it's hard to build the next treatment on top of that. Mm-hmm. So having said all that and vented a little bit, let's just say that the pipeline in Alzheimer's drug development is quite robust, with many different drugs at different phases, phase 1 to phase 3, tackling different aspects of the disease and at different stages, all the way from prevention to later stage disease. And you need a pipeline like that, because you know that drugs are going to drop out, that only a fraction of the drugs being tested will become successful and cross the finish line in phase 3. And yet we have many opportunities. I'm excited about drugs that could work well with Leqembi or independently to slow disease by tackling different parts of the inflammatory pathway. And there are many other approaches as well. There are some genetic approaches now trying to get at the actual formation of amyloid, and also other approaches to turn off production of tau rather than waiting till these proteins aggregate and do damage and then trying to clear them with antibodies. We may be able to interfere with them very early on. So I think the field's excited about the potential, about combination therapy. And if you have a drug that, causes the disease to slow by 25% and another drug on top of that that offers another 25% disease slowing, and then you get 50%, you're building towards something much more livable in terms of dealing with Alzheimer's. So let's just keep pushing.
I think you can see why we were so excited about having Rob and Sharon join us this morning. It was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I have many questions. I'm sure many of the viewers do as well, left unanswered. And there's much for us to do. We really want to thank both Rob and Sharon for being on being our speakers today. And we appreciate your time as well, the audience. And we also want to thank our VOA sponsors, ASI and Lilly. We've covered a lot of ground regarding Alzheimer's treatment and access concerns, and we hope that you'll be able to take away some of this information. We will not test you on it, however, but we do urge all of you to take action, as Rob and Sharon have so strongly endorsed, that the next steps you can take right now may influence CMS's coverage decision. And as Sharon pointed out, as long as we don't have coverage for Leqembi or other amyloid clearing treatments, that slows down the whole pipeline. So the whole pipeline is paused. So afterward, we'll be sending our listeners a survey. Included will be links to messages that you can use to send an email to the CMS administrator. Please take a few minutes to do this. We would also appreciate any feedback that you have about the event and upcoming topics that you would like us to cover in future webinars. So thank you. Thanks again, especially to our speakers, and we look forward to talking to you again. Good day.